Welcome to Talking with Children About War and Other Humanitarian Crises. My name is Leora, she, hers. I'm on the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Technology Center staff. I'm the School Mental Health Field Director, and I'm here with my colleagues Ida and Ingrid and our advisor and constant colleague, Dr. David Schoenfeld at the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. We are funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. The talking points of today's speaker, myself and David and others, are their opinions only, and we're really grateful to be continued to be funded by SAMHSA so that we can provide content and learning such as this. This is a really big topic. It's a really charged topic. It's a really necessary and urgent topic to be in learning about how to talk to children about war and other humanitarian crises. And I really want to name that even in the title, which David will share more about, even in the title, we could actually spend 90 minutes talking about the word choice and language choice in the title itself. The real purpose of today's conversation is to give us more skills in some of the moments that we might imagine being the hardest, but in actuality, because we practice the skill of conversation, it might decrease our own nerves so that we can be in connection rather than creating more confusion. So that's what we're hoping we hold today together. Okay, so of course, why this and why now? I want to name that, just as I said at the very beginning, this session is hoping to cover so much, and knowing that the world is witnessing and experiencing and contributing to enormous amounts and kinds of pain that we are all witnessing and holding. And I want to just name that from Morocco to Afghanistan to Armenia to Gaza to Israel to many, many other lands, including our own, in our own country, that we have both seen, caused, named, experienced humanitarian crises at the border. We experience humanitarian crises across our country in the pandemic of gun violence that many of us are holding and witnessing. Some of us are coming with this in our own bodies, in our own personal families and cultures. Some of us are coming into this conversation because we're in charge of leading communications for school districts and counties and mental health associations. And we want to know how to even navigate how to talk with adults about talking to children, right? The concentric circles of conversation. And many of us are just here because we have kids ourselves as parents and caregivers, and we're feeling like we need to be a little bit more resourced in this moment. David's going to walk us through his wisdom that has been harvested over many, many years working with many populations having experienced big moments. This session is not intended to be a socio-political course, a 101, a 90-minute 101 on all the pains and hurts in the world. And I want to just offer us that if you're having a moment where you're in disagreement with something David is saying or something I'm saying, that you are more than welcome. We want to be in discourse as a field to put in the Q&A. I approach that differently. Here's how I approach it, right? Or if you are in deep agreement or resonance with something, hey, that really meets a need that I have, and here's why. And that kind of sharing can really help us build our collective muscles to hold things that are really difficult and things that can create fracture when they may not need to. So we're hoping to create and foster dialogue that is more connected and focused in curiosity versus analysis. A model of that is that David and I we had a 5-minute, do we even agree with this Gabor Mate quote ourselves? And David and I are in a little bit of disagreement about it. I want to say, here's the point of why I centered the quote right here and now. Which is, we know that children can absolutely get traumatized because they get hurt, absolutely. And what we're hoping that we continue to build is our commitment and dedication that young people don't have to feel alone and overwhelmed in wonderment of what they're seeing and witnessing, either in social media, what they're hearing us talk about in the kitchen, what they're seeing at school. It's that aloneness that can sometimes feel even more overwhelming than the experience of hurt in the first place. And David might have disagreement with that too, and that's good. We're into it. So again, purpose is for us to figure out and stand with how we can lean into our own discomfort so that we can support young people in this moment. I'm going to pass it to Dr. Schoenfeld to lead us through the conversation. And we're so grateful that you said yes to this. Thank you for being here.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's good to be here. So what I'm going to try to review is some practical advice for both educators as well as caregivers, whether those are parents or other people who care directly for children, about how do we talk with children about wars and other humanitarian crises. So the first point is we need to recognize it's important to discuss these events with children. Being silent about a crisis obviously doesn't protect children from what happened. It only prevents them from understanding and ultimately coping with it. And not communicating about what's happening during a crisis may even increase the anxiety, leading children to imagine that there are more dangerous and personally threatening events that are about to occur. And the chances are they're going to find out about it anyway. I had the opportunity to work with the Aurora Public School System after the shooting that happened at the midnight showing of the Batman movie in the movie theater over the summer. And I was talking with them about when the kids returned back to school. The school district was actually taking the lead in some of the emotional response and recovery for the students. And so we talked about having conversations in classrooms in the first period on the first day back to school. And I remember at one point the question was raised, well, at what grade level do we start that? And although there was some disagreement, I said, well, I think even the kindergarteners have heard about Batman, so I would imagine it would be any child in the school. And the superintendent agreed with that. But I remember talking to one of the parents who was an employee at the school, and she shared with me that she wanted me to share this example with others. And she said that her initial inclination was not to tell her child. She said he's, only 5 years old. He hasn't even entered kindergarten. And so she made sure not to have any conversations in the home after the shooting occurred that he could overhear. They didn't have the television on, they didn't leave news out, they didn't talk about it in front of him. And they thought that they had kept him unaware of what had happened and were protecting him. And she said that one day, a couple of weeks later, she suggested at dinner that they go to see a Disney film. And he said simply, we shouldn't go to the movies. There's someone there shooting people. And so she asked him, where did you find out that that had happened? Well, she had taken him to, I think, the rec center for a swimming lesson. And in the pool, one of the other children told him. And she looked at me and she said, it's bad enough that I didn't talk to him about it. But now I know that he was worried about it. And what bothers me the most is he didn't even tell me he was worried about it because I didn't tell him that we could talk about it. And she said, so please, let's have these conversations starting in kindergarten. Let's not hold back. And she shared that she thought what she had done was wrong, and that ultimately she wanted her child to know that if there was ever anything that was important, he would be able to talk to her about it because she would be able to talk with him. So the first thing I think you do in these situations is you begin by asking children what they already know or heard. This has been going on for quite some time, so chances are they've already gotten some information, whether that's from television, the internet, social media, school, friends, or simply overheard comments from adults or other children. But much of their information may not be accurate, or they may have misunderstood what they actually heard that was accurate. So as the children explain what they know about the situation, you want to look for information that's missing, misinformation, and misunderstandings, especially if those are causing more concerns. So let me turn to what do children understand and how can we improve that understanding? So there are ineffective communication with children about a difficult topic can be due either to the source of the information or the recipient of the information, in this case, the child. And I wanted to go over briefly some of the different causes of each of those. So let's start out with the source of information. So this is independent of how the child processes or comprehends the information. It has to do with the delivery of the information. So there may be misinformation, and that's unintentional mistakes. There could be disinformation. That's knowingly false information that's created to mislead or to cause harm. So that would include things like conspiracy theories or rumors that are intentionally created. There's also something called malinformation, and that involves more the misuse of information. So, for example, it might be the public release of private information with an intent to cause harm to someone. And it involves information that is accurate, but it's used intentionally out of context to mislead or cause harm to others. Now, adults may want to acknowledge pretty early on that even the adults don't know exactly what's right of everything that's going on. And this is particularly in the context of an evolving crisis. The news can change quickly, and there are also conflicting viewpoints. And I think that's what we're seeing in the current war in Israel and Gaza, is that there are these disagreements about what's happened, what's accurate. But some of the information may also be misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. But some of them are legitimate not knowing what has actually happened or different perspectives. Now, that's all the source of the information. But I wanted to focus more on the recipient information. How does the child process the information that they hear? So some confusion because there may be missing information that's critical. So they may not know where Gaza is, for example, if they're not involved in some other way or connected to that community, or they may not even know where Israel is if you're talking about a very young child. The child may also misunderstand information that's correct. So I'm going to give you an example from my own child. Remember, she was in 4th grade when 9/11 happened. And one night, I was tucking her in, and I noticed that she looked concerned, and I asked her what her concern was about. And she looked at me and she said, "I'm worried that Afghanistan may have nuclear capacity." She was about 9 at the time. I did not understand where this was coming from, but my wife drove her to school often, and she had NPR on a lot of time, and they were talking about concerns about Iraq obtaining nuclear capacity, and she confused Afghanistan with Iraq, and she knew that we were bombing as a country Afghanistan and was concerned about retaliation with nuclear weapons. Now, that is not something I imagined she would be concerned about. But she heard correct information and she just kind of misunderstood it given the context of where she was at. I'm going to get back to this later, that should never really assume that we know what children are worried about. We need them to be able to explain it. And fortunately, all I had to do was say, "Dear, what's worrying you?" And she just told me, and then we discussed it, and she wasn't as concerned about that element. Not saying that what was going on wasn't scary, but at least that was one less thing she had to worry about. Now, the child may be given correct information, but may misinterpret it. And there are a number of reasons why kids may misinterpret information. One is what we call literal misinterpretations. So you might, for example, say to your child, there was an earthquake in a town in China, and they might think that's an earthquake in Chinatown, which is right near where they live, or perhaps maybe they live in Chinatown. And so they have just this literal misinterpretation that causes them unnecessary concern. And once they explain to you what their concern is, you may be able to help them understand it better. But they may also fail to understand the underlying concept. So if you're talking to a very young child, for example, they may have difficulty understanding what you mean by genocide. So you might say that's the intentional destruction of a people, usually defined as an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group. But 4-year-old or 5-year-old, for example, may not normally conceptualize people within these categorizations. So they may just not understand what you mean by that, even if you explain the term. So realize that there may be misinterpretations, but there may also be trouble with their conceptual understanding, and all of that can limit what they understand and how they cope with it. Now, obviously, children who have different abilities in language, cognitive development, will be more or less prone to process even accurate information effectively. So the complexity of effective communication, though, gets much more complicated in the context of a crisis. Because in a crisis situation, even adults who would normally fully understand the concepts and could process the information may not be as capable of doing that when they're upset. And that's one of the reasons we suggest limiting media exposure. And if you are going to share media coverage with children, it's probably best to record it beforehand and then have the adult view it beforehand to make sure it is appropriate. But it also allows you to pause the media to check for comprehension, answer questions, and respond to reactions. Whereas if you're watching it live, that becomes more difficult to do. Now, children and youth of different ages and abilities will understand and react differently, in part to their developmental age. But it depends on other things besides that. It may be children's unique personal experiences, their personalities, or their coping styles. For example, some children use additional information to better understand and cope with a situation, whereas some children are more likely to become more sensitized the more information that they have. So that's why I think you can do it differently if you're talking to your own children when you understand that context. But when you get a group of children together, it's probably going to be quite variable among the children, even if they're all of the same developmental period and similar experiences. So the amount of detail that children will find useful, therefore, varies greatly. So in general, the older the child is, the more they're going to benefit and be able to take advantage of discussion, and will have more questions and have more concerns that need more discussion. But the reality is, no matter how old children are, begin by providing just the basic information in simple and direct terms. I'm finding a lot of people are trying to figure out how to help children understand all that's going on and all the implications it has. And I think when we try and discuss a war that happened in the past, we call that history. And we do then try and help them understand the context and contextualize it based on everything that went on during that time and the learnings that we can draw from that. But in the middle of a war, you probably are not trying to conduct a history lesson. You're trying to help them understand it to a basic degree, but most importantly, to help them cope with the personal experience that's going on. So I think you want to be briefer in your conversations and discussion in the midst of a war, especially when you're talking to groups of children. It's one thing if it's your own child and you feel that child is ready to understand the context a little bit more and you wish to contextualize it because of your beliefs within your family. When you're talking about groups of children, I think that can be quite risky and isn't necessarily the focus we should have. So start with simple information, basic information, and then be guided by the questions they have or what further information they indicate they would like. But throughout all of this, you want to avoid exposure to graphic images and repetitive media coverage. It is useful for children to know enough to feel that they understand what's occurred, but it isn't helpful for children nor for adults to be exposed to graphic images, excessive or detailed information, or continuous repetitive media coverage. I remember some years ago, there was a situation where there was a terrorist group who had killed someone that they had taken hostage, and they did this in a gruesome manner and videotaped it and streamed it, and it was then available pretty widely on the internet. And during that time, apparently there was I believe it was a middle school or maybe a high school teacher who showed the video to the class during school. The logic that was given was that the children were going to watch it anyway, and it was better to watch this with an adult who can help them process this. So as a result, I was on a listserv of child development specialists dealing with crisis response. And so I got the question and they told me about what had happened. And then they asked, could you please comment at what age it's appropriate for a child to view this? Under what circumstances? Should it be shown in a school setting? And there was a list of maybe a half dozen questions at that point. I was traveling internationally at the time, so I was very time pressured. I think I was actually in between flights, and I read this and I was kind of appalled. I was like, this is kind of obvious that this never should have happened. Why would anyone ask the question from a major television network about this? So I only had about 10 minutes before I had to reboard. So I wrote a very quick message, which basically said, this should never have been done to a human being or an animal for that matter, should never have been videotaped. It should never have been shown, and no one should ever watch it. The only reason it was shown was to upset people. It was an act of terrorism, and therefore it is not news. It is terrorism, and it should never be viewed. And then I got on my plane. By the time I had landed, I checked back and saw that on the website they had posted just my answers exactly as I had stated it. And I realized I just wanted to give credit to the television station that, they don't give expert advice. They provide news. They ask experts. So appropriately, they asked in an objective way without having a personal opinion. But the only thing they posted was that opinion. So they were right, I think, to ask the question. I probably shouldn't have been upset by it, but answered it very clearly. So the point is, just because something horrific is out there doesn't mean we should watch it. And I think that there have already been things which have been shown during this war and other wars, and we should be cautious about whether it's ever appropriate for anyone to view that. In a similar manner, I remember some time ago traveling, and I heard on the radio that they were now embedding reporters at the front lines of in certain wars. And so they were talking about this, and they said, the comment was made, it's like you're on the front line. And all I could remember thinking was, I don't want to be on the front line. I think some people have to be on the front line to preserve safety, well-being, and preserve democracy. There are reasons why people go to war to protect others. So I'm not questioning that, but I don't think they want to be there. It isn't a good thing to do. And so if you don't have to be there, I think we should ask, why do you want to experience as if you were? So it gets back to the perspective of just because it's available doesn't mean that we should view it. Now, I think people talk about this with very graphic, violent images, but it isn't just physical violence. Evocative interviews of those who were injured, or the families and friends of those who died or who were captured, even if they don't show any physical violence or destruction, can be very unsettling for children as well as adults. It may reactivate feelings of grief for children who've experienced the death of a friend or family member, even if it's unrelated to violent means. And we know that a lot of children, particularly during the pandemic, but for all the reasons that Leora outlined, also have had multiple losses. I went to Las Vegas after the shooting in Mandalay Bay. And I had actually been in Las Vegas and doing training prior to some schools. And so I was there like within a day of when this shooting happened. And I was talking to some educators, and for one of the schools that had already had the training, I had warned them that when incidents occur in the news, it may activate children's feelings of loss from other events in their lives or worries about that it might occur to someone that they care about. And the schools were already telling me that that had happened. In one school, for example, they said they had an elementary school age child who was down in the office crying because her mother had cancer and she was afraid her mother would die of cancer. Her mother hadn't just been diagnosed. It's just they saw the images on television of people crying about the deaths of those they loved. And she started to think that could be me, and also was concerned. I went to another school. This was a private school, and they had not gotten any training before, from me at least, or on this topic. And so I was talking with the school, and initially the head of the school did not think the elementary school teachers needed to attend. But as I started the presentation after school, he left. I wasn't sure why, but actually he was going to contact all the elementary staff and tell them to join the same meeting. It applies to them as well. So I was talking about this phenomenon that kids might start getting upset about something else that's happened or is happening in their life. And one of the math teachers in elementary school said, "Oh yeah, that's what happened earlier today. In the middle of a math class, one of the kids got upset, ran out of the room crying. I didn't know what was going on. I followed him into the bathroom and he was sobbing because his grandfather had died a year ago." And he said, "We were just doing math class. And so now I'm in a bathroom with a sobbing child who's grieving, and the rest of my class is alone in the classroom." And they didn't have a school counselor or social worker. So he said, "What do you want me to do in those situations?" So the issue is these events can uncover feelings, fears, worries, concerns, and reactions of the children, even if what they went through is not similar to what's going on now. And of course, it's not just the kids, it happens to the adults as well. So we all need to be aware of that. So in talking about the media coverage, make sure that you watch your media consumption. You want to make sure it's a healthy diet and you don't want to consume too much of it. So I think it's helpful to explain to others and to remind ourselves there are really only two main reasons to watch, listen to, or read media coverage related to an evolving crisis situation. One is to be reassured, and the other is to learn practical steps that you can take to keep yourself and those you care about safe or safer. So if you're watching, listening to, or reading coverage of a humanitarian crisis, and you aren't getting reassured, you already know what happened, and you aren't learning actions to take, then it's probably a good time to disconnect from media, at least for a period of time. It's a good time to instead come together with family and community for support. So you want to pay attention to the media, but you want to make sure that it's periodic and that you're getting accurate information and that it's helpful to you in some perspective. But just finding out more about atrocious things is not helpful to people. You just need to know enough about what's going on so you understand it and can get and have an opinion of what should be done. But most importantly, you know what to do to be able to help others and to help yourself. So the next thing I wanted to turn to was really, what do we reassure children about? And as we talk to children, we have to remember that we can't assume that they have the same worries that we have. I already gave that example of my own daughter worrying about something I hadn't considered. And you really can't provide effective reassurance to people of any age, whether those are children or adults, until we know what specific concerns they have. Otherwise, all we're doing is telling them what we feel is reassuring, but we're not offering them reassurance for what worries them. And I always tell people that when two people talk, each from their own perspective, I call that arguing, and that rarely provides reassurance to people. So what you want to do is first find out, what are they concerned about? Which means you have to ask them, and then you have to listen to it. You want to provide honest explanations to correct the misunderstandings or the misinformation, but we also don't want to ignore or minimize children's fears. We don't want to pretend they aren't afraid or should be afraid, but rather we want to help children identify ways to cope with anxiety, sadness, and fears. Crises remind us all that we're never completely safe, but during and immediately after a crisis is actually the best time to reassure children that they should feel safe in their school, in their home, and in their community to the extent that is accurate. So if you are not in a country that is at war, it's important to reassure them that we are in a community which is safer. Now, the challenge here is that some children are going to be impacted more than other children, and may need more reassurance and support. And so if children have family or friends in the area that's experiencing the crisis, the news is going to feel very close to home to them potentially. And children who are in families who feel strong ties due to shared religious affiliation or ethnic affiliation, etc., they may also feel quite connected and more directly impacted. But even children who have no personal relationships to anyone directly impacted by the crisis may also have troubling reactions. For example, children who live in communities characterized by high rates of violence may become more concerned about their own physical safety when they hear about war. Those who are part of communities that have experienced racial discrimination may feel increase in distress and anger when they hear about acts of aggression and bias in other countries. As well, they may also worry about risks of bullying or attacks in their own communities. Children who have experienced poverty or food insecurity may feel anxious hearing stories of families with limited food or money for other basic necessities in the aftermath of even a natural disaster. News reports and stories may be activating for children who have themselves survived wars or other humanitarian crises, or whose families have experienced refugee status. We're seeing that in very large numbers of children really throughout the United States and abroad. But children who have no apparent connection can still be quite affected. Part of it is what we refer to in the bereavement field as the threat to the assumptive world. We make assumptions every day that allow us to feel safe and secure despite real risks that occur throughout our life and our daily experiences. I remember when there was an attack from a terrorist group in Paris at a nightclub. And at that time, my daughter, who was a young adult living in New York, texted me to ask if she should not go to a nightclub that evening in New York. I didn't really understand what that was about, so I responded, and then I eventually just said, please get on the phone. I can't do this through text message. So she got on the phone and she explained to me that there had been an attack from ISIS in a Paris nightclub, and that there was some discussion in Twitter that I wasn't aware of, where people were saying this is part of an international attack. And she therefore reasoned that if it happened in Paris and you wanted to attack another international city, New York might be a reasonable target. So she said, Dad, I'm just worried that maybe this will happen at the nightclub I'm going to in New York. Should I be concerned? So I said, well, dear, there always is a possibility that there will be an attack wherever you go. But to be quite honest, if you go to a new nightclub in New York and there is shooting that occurs, it's less likely to be a terrorist attack and more likely to be through, interpersonal conflict for people in New York. And she said, Dad, I know that. That just happened last weekend. I was assuming she meant about a different nightclub that she wasn't in, but she said, I know that. I said, dear, the actual risk of this happening in any nightclub that you go to tonight is extremely, extremely low. And she said, Dad, I know it's low, but it's just higher than it was yesterday. So just the sense of knowing that it happened somewhere reminded her it can happen. And then she felt a little bit more vulnerable. So at that point, I tried to discuss it with her more, but she illustrated another point that you talk to kids when they want to talk to you. And she said, Dad, I have to get ready for the nightclub. I got to get dressed and put my makeup on. I don't have time to talk to you. So she got off the phone. But then several hours later, she sent a text message to me that she had gotten back from the nightclub and that there wasn't anything bad that happened. I think somebody spilled some drink on her dress. She needed dry cleaning, but otherwise all was good. And I remember thinking at the time, now I live in California, so 3 hours earlier, so she knew I was still up when she came back. But I also recognized that my daughter still felt the need to text me and tell me that she was okay. I wasn't worried about her, but she obviously was worried about herself and wanted to make sure that her dad knew that she survived her evening. She doesn't tell me when she goes out and doesn't certainly text me when she gets back other times. So she was a little concerned about this, even though it didn't affect her in any direct or even indirect way. Now, on the other hand, I do want to explain the flip side is true, that some children may not be particularly distressed even after major crisis events when they don't personally impact them. During that trip to Las Vegas, as I was leaving, I was actually on my way back to the airport, and one of the mental health providers that had hosted my visit texted me because she wanted to talk about her 8-year-old child's comments that he had just made to her. Apparently, he said, Mom, I'm going to be quite honest with you. It's horrible what happened at Mandalay Bay, but I wasn't there. I don't know anybody that was there. I don't go to the Las Vegas Strip. And to be quite honest, it doesn't bother me. He said, it's unfortunate, but it's not upsetting me personally. So his mother just turned to him and said, well, dear, we all grieve in our own way. And he looked at her and he said, Mom, you're not listening to me. I'm not grieving. That's my point. And at that point, she actually became concerned. So she texted me because she wanted to make sure that she was asking me, is there something wrong with my child's relatedness, that he isn't bothered by this? And I just said, you should be happy that your child's willing to tell you his true feelings. Now, he did say to her, I will never say this to anyone else because I'm not proud of it. And I think people will be upset if I say it, but I'm just sharing it with you. And I said, please be grateful your child is willing to share their honest feelings with you. That is a good thing. No, not all children get upset about every tragedy that occurs in the country or outside of the country. So that's part of what makes this so difficult in classroom settings, because you have very discrepant views, very discrepant experiences, and people will have very different feelings. And that's why it becomes much more complicated in those situations. Now, I wanted to turn a little to the phenomenon of guilt. All children and adults may wonder what could have been done to prevent a humanitarian crisis. Now, it's obviously going to seem very clear to adults that there's nothing children in the United States, for example, or anywhere in the world could have done to prevent this war. But children may still feel helpless and wish they could have changed what's happened. So let children know this is a common reaction. We all wish that there's something that we could have done for this. But in addition to feelings of guilt, it's also natural to engage in thoughts of blame. In some ways, blaming is a way we feel we can regain control of uncomfortable feelings and in some way diminish a sense of personal risk. However, when individuals and groups take aggressive action against those they deem as being responsible, their actions are often misdirected and may even harm innocent people. They may focus on people who are easy to identify for blame, such as people who look like they might belong to a group that includes those who were responsible. And this misguided blame does not ease the immediate feelings of grief and fear, and they complicate and worsen matters instead of providing solutions for the future. I went to one school that had had a mass shooting, and the shooter was still alive and in custody. And there was a lot of anger on the part of students that someone that they considered a classmate and friend had murdered other people in the school. Now, what wasn't released publicly, or at least I wasn't aware of it publicly, was that the shooter was actually of Russian heritage. And this was in a community where there was already some discrimination against the Russian immigrants, which were a sizable number within this community. And to make it a little bit more complicated, this happened around the time that there were concerns about changes in the election results in the United States based on Russian influence. So as this was going on, there were comments being placed in social media among the students that this individual did this as a Russian and therefore deserves the death penalty. There was a lot of discussion about should this child be tried as an adult and was the death penalty appropriate? Now, this was being said in social media, being read by the shooter's friends and cousins and other relatives in the school. So you can imagine that that was a very complicated situation, and it was coming up in classroom discussions. And so the teachers were like, what do we possibly say? I mean, I don't want to get into the whole politics of what's happened in the elections. I don't want them to discriminate against people of Russian heritage because we have many students and staff who are also of Russian heritage. What can you possibly say? So I explained to them that one way to approach it would be to say that it's understandable that you're angry about what occurred, and you may be looking for who you can blame or who's responsible. We know that the Russian government did not plan this shooting in our school. And so I do want to make sure that everyone within the classroom feels comfortable as we have conversations such as this. So I'm going to ask that you restate it, or in the future, state it in a way that doesn't accuse one group or type of person for what happened, as opposed to just the responsibility for the person who actually did the shooting. That way we can all feel safe and respected, so we can continue to talk. So I gave that as an example because I said you don't want to attack the student who is angry, and use similar, but you want to keep a safe and respectful environment within the classroom. So I remember one of the teachers came up to me afterwards and she said, "Could you write down what it was that you said?" And I remember my response to her was, "I don't actually pay that much attention to what I say, so I just made it up. I don't actually remember." She said, "Well, while that may very well be true, I am sure you can make up another response." So I said, "Okay, that's fair. Why don't you give me your email address and I'll send it to you?" And she said, "Don't email it to me. Email it to the principal. Every teacher in the school needs to know how to answer that." So I think we need to figure out, how do we respond to comments when we're in classroom settings, so that we create and maintain safe and respectful environments, but we also, and we don't though, ignore blame that is put on others because of similar background or heritage. Now, the next point I wanted to make is, when there is a crisis, we need to recognize that children may become even more concerned about what affects them personally. We should expect children to think more about themselves, at least for the time being. Once children start to feel safe themselves and they feel they understand what's going on, then they may want to help others, and we should find appropriate ways that they can provide assistance to others. And this is still effective, though, even if the assistance isn't provided to the direct victims of the particular crisis event. We did a lot of work with the students and staff at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in Parkland, Florida, after the mass shooting, as well as through the entire Broward County public school system. And one of the questions that came up, I remember discussing this with a group of student leaders, was that the shooting happened on Valentine's Day. So they asked if it was appropriate to celebrate Valentine's Day the next year. This was actually an important holiday and culturally for these students, and so they did a lot to celebrate Valentine's Day in general each year, and they had done a lot on the day of that shooting. So I looked at them and I said, "Well, I don't think you should stop demonstrating that you love others. I don't think we want the shooter to eliminate love. And so why don't you consider leaning into it?" So what they decided, and we discussed this and they agreed to it, was, instead of ignoring that it was Valentine's Day, why don't they make it a day of love and service? So throughout the school district, throughout the school, but also throughout that community and the entire school district, which I think they have about 275,000 students, it's a very large school district, they created an annual day of love and service. And so they focus on service learning and community service. And this has now been instituted as an annual event and voted on by the Board of Ed in all the schools in the district. So they're helping others. They're not necessarily helping the victims of that particular shooting, but they're providing help to others. And I think that if children feel that they're able to help others, they feel less powerless, even if they're not able to help the direct victims of the event. Now, really what I think children and teens need most in these situations is someone they trust that can listen to their questions, accept and acknowledge their feelings, and simply be there for them. So you don't need to worry about saying exactly the right thing, because there's really no answer that's going to make everything okay in situations such as this. So listen to their thoughts and their concerns. Answer their questions with simple, direct, and honest responses. Provide reassurance when it is appropriate. Don't give false reassurance. And offer support. Realize that children may ask questions about why something like this could or did occur. They may say to you, "How could anybody do something like this?" They don't necessarily expect adults to have the answers to this. Just like adults, they may pose rhetorical questions. And so I think we sometimes as adults feel we always have to have the answers, and then we feel we can't talk about it if we don't have those answers. But they can be rhetorical questions. And sometimes the best answer, for example, a parent or other caregiver, is to acknowledge that the situation seems unfair, to offer to give your child a hug, or simply to sit with them in silence. Now realize that while you're discussing this, children may show some distress when they're talking about a distressing situation. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. This is the first step in coping with their feelings and adjusting to their new understanding of the world. So it's not a bad thing if children share with you that they're distressed about something that's distressing. What you'd want to do then is pause the conversation periodically so you can provide and offer support and comfort. And if kids or an individual child is very upset, then feel free to ask whether they wish to continue the discussion at another time. But a lot of times adults tell me they're afraid they're going to demonstrate that they're distressed as well. And the adults, to be honest, are often more impacted than children in events like this. They may have stronger ties to another part of the world. They may have a more thorough understanding of the actual risks and how this can get worse or how this may impact more and more people. They also have a greater number and history of trauma or loss that can be activated. So we need to acknowledge that this is difficult for us and for the other adults. And it's actually helpful for children to realize it's okay to show others when you're upset. Otherwise, they may feel they need to hide their feelings, and then they have to deal with them alone. So caregivers should share their own feelings, but to the extent that they can model positive ways that they cope with them. So you might say, for example, as a classroom educator, when I first heard about this last night, I had trouble sleeping. But then I realized I talked with my husband or wife about it, and I started to feel better knowing that other people shared similar feelings. Or I wrote down my thoughts and just putting it on paper made it more manageable. So in other words, you're sharing that you have distress, but in the service of modeling effective coping techniques. So what you want to do is make sure that you're not just sharing your angst, your anger, your hatred, your desire for revenge. I'm not suggesting that that's helpful, but I think you can share some of your feelings. I was angry. I felt I was sometimes blaming other people who weren't responsible. But then I found out more about what was going on and I realized, X. Now, when a major world crisis event like this occurs, and there's associated media coverage, I think it's a good idea to bring this up with children, even if they are quite young. At first, some of the older children and teens may tell you they don't want to or need to discuss it. And it's generally then not a good idea to force them to talk with you. So keep the door open for them to return and discuss it later. But let them know you're available when they're ready to talk, and let them choose what the right time is to do so. When a crisis results in a lot of death and or destruction, it's going to be natural to be upset, as I mentioned. But I'm talking with caregivers like parents, I usually tell them if children continue to be very upset for several days, if they seem unable to cope with their fears, or they're having trouble in school, at home, or with their friends, so they're having difficulty with daily tasks, then it's a good idea for them to speak with someone outside the family for advice. Caregivers may wish to speak with a teacher or school counselor, their pediatrician, or mental health professional. I always remind people that they shouldn't wait until they think their children need counseling. They should take advantage of counseling and support whenever they feel it might be helpful. And that's with adults too. I think we have to be cautious about asking them if they need counseling. I think we just want to make sure if they could benefit from it, that they can access it. So I thought before we open it up to questions, I'll just tell you about some guidance documents that you can download if you're interested. We do have a guidance document for parents and educators and other caregivers about talking to children and teens about the Israel-Gaza war. It's on the website for the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. It also was incorporated into an article in healthychildren.org, which is the American Academy of Pediatrics family-facing website. We also do have a guidance document for talking to children and teens about the war in Ukraine. And we also talk about grief over the holidays. And I think you will find that grief is sometimes quite difficult over holidays, which have very positive connotations, particularly Thanksgiving. It's a time to gather with family. It's a time to give thanks. It's really hard to do if you know someone who died in a war, or a family member is a hostage or has died, and is not there at the table with you, or is not there figuratively at the table with you. So I'm going to give a very mundane example, not to trivialize the situation, but I remember on Good Friday many years ago, one of my daughters came to me and was concerned about her rabbit. And at that point, we didn't think anything was that wrong, but we went to a vet at night, and within an hour, we had to euthanize the bunny. It's totally unanticipated. And I remember talking to my daughter on Monday, and she said, "Dad, you have no idea how many pictures of rabbits appear in children's television shows and commercials over Easter weekend." She said it was just so painful. Everything she saw was talking about happy bunnies, and it really was harder for her. Now imagine if you're going to multiply that by the death of someone that you care about in a war setting, and everybody's celebrating Thanksgiving, and every sitcom talks about how great it is to be thankful for the family that you have and are with. It's just a difficult time period. So we do have a guidance document on grief over the holidays. We also do have a guidance document on talking to kids about tragedies such as shootings and terror attacks in the news, which we have available for parents and other caregivers in both English and Spanish versions. But that's what we have on the National Center's webpage. There are other places that you can go for information. I'm just really going to talk about, we have website resources for the National Center, as well as the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. And this just has contact information about the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement if you would like more information. I'm going to turn it over to Leora.
Developmental differentiation. What are different ways that listening in to young people, and actually you offered them across the course of your daughter's lifespan, from clubbing to bunny rabbit, but I wanted to see if you might be able to offer, for those of us who work with young kiddos, 4 to 6, with some of us are grandparents in the room, to young adults, what might be a way that you can offer how something could be differentiated across the developmental timeline?
Yeah, so clearly what children can understand and benefit from discussing varies by their developmental period. And so you want to keep it fairly simple when you're talking to, say, a 4-year-old. They probably just need to know at some level that there was a war, and in war, people hurt each other, and it's happening at a distant place. You can name where that is. Say that's a country, if it's a country that's far away from where you live, and that some people are very upset about it because it's very bad and people die. That's, you don't necessarily need to go much further for most 3 and 4-year-olds. You do want to name it so they know what what people are talking about and why people are upset. But obviously, if you're talking to a high school student, it's going to be a very different explanation. But one caution that I would give is we tend to assume that with older individuals, say adults, they understand and can understand more. So we just go right to what happened in more detail than they're able to process. I remember some years ago, I was talking to some parents, and they were physicians, and they had traveled from out of state to come to a specialized clinic in Duchenne muscular dystrophy that asked me to see some of their families. And they wanted to, the child had been diagnosed 6 months ago, and they were coming for a comprehensive evaluation. And so I met with them about how to talk to their child about the diagnosis and disclose it and help him cope. He was only like 7 at the time. And so I said to them at one point, please let me know if you want to talk about any of this further, if things come up during the evaluation, your visit, because it was several days. So they asked to see me at the end, which I was kind of surprised. And I said, I think they misunderstood. I really wasn't asking them to comment on the whole clinic visit, but to comment on what we had discussed. But they said, we came here, we are physicians, and over the past 3 days, every subspecialist has told us all the ways our child is likely to die. And it was overwhelming. No parent should ever be told that. Yes, we understand all of it, but it was almost cruel to go over that with us. You need to tell them not to do that. Now, I wasn't there to critique the clinic. That wasn't my goal, but that was their point, is we got way too much. Now, they were physicians, so they politely listened, but that was not helpful to them. And I really wish they had just spoken up and said, hey, tell us how he's doing now and what we have to do over the next year. But they gave all this bad information, which was overwhelming to them. And I've seen people give bad news to people and they just go too far, and people don't listen anymore. They're not able to absorb it. It's just overwhelming. So I guess what I would say is, first off, think about what you would say to a 5-year-old, and chances are that's not a bad way to start with an adult, at least for the first couple sentences. But then the issue is you go further. So then I think what you do with older kids and adults is say, okay, I've told you what just happened. I wouldn't say it happened in a place very, very far away. Obviously, you can say it happened in this country. Let me remind you where that country is located. You can give a little bit more of the context, but I would stop them and I would say, what questions do you have? How do you feel about that? What are your reactions? Let's discuss what you'd like to discuss. So I think your initial notification may not be that different, depending on the age. I think it's how long you continue the conversation and how much additional information you give, but recognize that you may have an adolescent who right at that moment doesn't want to talk about it anymore. And then I don't know that you would push it. I mean, obviously, if their parent is in the war and they say, I really don't want to talk about it, then I would say, hey, we probably should have some conversation. Let's talk later today. So I think there are situations, obviously, where you need to talk a little bit more about something that affects them directly. But if it doesn't, I think it's not really that dissimilar. But I think in the first couple sentences, I think it's how long we continue it and how much more depth we give to the answers that we provide.
Thanks, David. I want to name that I appreciate that all of us have a inner 5-year-old that needs to be seen and heard, and that's a good starting place, and then taking it from there. And not saying that in an adultist way or in a pejorative way, but actually in a true, authentic way, that the beauty of a 5-year-old is asking open, honest, curious questions, and that we can start there and grow. And I also want to go back to your example, speaking of a developmental approach after and working with young people after the February 14th shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas, that one of the ways that we know, and I'm speaking as a former history teacher here, that one of the ways we know that young people often navigate and cope is by participating in action and finding ways to feel efficacious when the world feels overwhelming, right? It's that ability to have to take action when there's a feeling of action happening too.
One of the things I'd just like to add is that when you're trying to figure out how children can actively help, it's really important that we invite the children to give some ideas about what's meaningful response to them. I still remember that after we had the US had bombed Afghanistan, there was some movement that came out of the administration to encourage children to collect pennies to send to children in Afghanistan. And I remember my daughter came home from middle school and she said, Dad, like we were told that we were going to do this. And then they asked for a volunteer from the class, and I raised my hand to volunteer and I wasn't selected. And she said, what could make you feel more meaningless than not being allowed to collect change that people discard? Now, This is an issue that my daughter did discard pennies. I've tried to have a conversation with her, but that's a separate issue. So, but to me, I looked at her and I said, actually, I can't think of an example that would make you feel less powerless, more powerless than that. So let's think about, what do you want to do? What is it that you think? And it doesn't have to be that you're collecting money for Afghanistan, because she's not going to be able to, you know, compensate for bombing that's occurring by our country as a middle school child in the United States, but she could help other people. She could help people in her school, she could help me, she could help other people that are in need elsewhere. So it was like, let's figure out how you can help, even if you can't help in that particular situation. So people might say, I want to send things to people in whichever country, they is at war and having problems, and there may not be a mechanism to get it to them or in a way that can be helpful, but that doesn't mean that they can't help other people in their community. So I think we need to not only focus on giving them a way to help, but we have to give them a way to help that feels meaningful to them and doable.
We have a number of really beautiful community members in the House who are professionally tasked with supporting young people who have immigrant narratives and refugee narratives or have family lineage of being displaced. And I exactly, just as someone just named in the chat, that sometimes the proximity of something feeling really far away is actually really embodied and feels really close. Even if there's geographic distance, there might be lineage or cultural or financial, all the different ways the proximity gets closer. So I'm curious if you might share some of the ways that we can support young people who are experiencing and witnessing watching violence towards children that look like them and look like the people they love.
Yeah, well, let me start by also acknowledging that it may be that they're witnessing violence to people who don't look like them. And yet they still feel more vulnerable. That's when I had said, for children who live in communities where there's more violence, they may feel more endangered themselves. And so I think when children are in situations where they feel unsafe, they may first need to deal with their own safety before they can start to consider the needs of those who are similar or those who are not similar to them. So it may be that this will accentuate feelings of community violence or increase the grief that they feel over those that they've lost in the past due to community violence. And so I think it's fine to so what I wouldn't say is, we're really talking about what's happening in this country, not what's happening here. I wouldn't say that to children. I would say, it sounds to me like you're feeling unsafe right now. Let's talk about what we can do to help you feel safer in your own community, whether or not it's because there's something similar. Now, if people do feel some form of affiliation, whether it's because they have a religious affiliation that's similar, a cultural background that's similar, they look similar in some ways to them, or they're just children. They're seeing images of children having been killed, and they realize, wait, it affects kids, and I'm a kid. So however they feel that affiliation may make it feel closer and therefore more difficult for them, and may make them fear, for their own safety or feel more vulnerable. So I think we just kind of have to acknowledge that with kids and say, yes, it's really hard to see someone similar to you die in a situation like this. Or yes, because the other thing that I need to be conscious of is, if you focus too much on distressing events that happen far away, and kids are like, well, don't you realize the same things happened in my own community last week? There was someone that was shot and killed. You don't seem to care about that. So I do think we want to make sure that we connect to what's most meaningful to the children at the time, and that may vary even within the same group of kids. So in many times, I think we focus on events, we start talking about, there was a mass shooting that happened at this school, and then kids say things like, yeah, well, there's shootings that happen in our community all the time, and I don't see people talking about that. So I will share with you, and I was told I could share some of what we talked about in Broward County Public Schools after Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, that on our first visit there, to our first meeting, one of our first meetings, we said that whatever solution you come up with about how to help children deal with this event must also acknowledge the deaths that occur in communities, not from active shooters, but from the shooting that occurs within, communities of violence. Because the school district includes all of Fort Lauderdale, and they have some communities that are more characterized by urban violence that you see in other schools and other communities, sadly, across the country. And so we said from the very beginning, now this is as we're coming to consult about the shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas, that whatever solution you come up with has to take into account the needs of these other communities as well. And to their credit, they said, of course it does. And that's what we want to do. So I think that that's part of a positive response, is that when people see there are broader needs, and although I don't want to kind of give credit to any particular group, on being at the March for Our Life and observing that firsthand, I was really struck by the fact that the students there did actively say, that came from Marjory Stoneman Douglas and throughout Broward, that shootings like this don't just affect their community. It affects many communities around the world, and not just from mass shooters from outside the community. And that we really need to think about the needs of all students. So I do think it's an important point. I didn't want to in any way suggest that we should focus only on external events, but kids, when they're upset, are going to focus more on their needs, and I think that's quite appropriate.
I'm wondering if we can spend a little time unpacking this construct of safety. And so many of us want to say, you are safe, we are safe, or something of that variation. And we've got folks both in the Q&A and in chat, and both of us know that safety is a construct, that it's hard to tell someone, ourselves, especially when we know that that our assumptive world is wanting safety, and knowing that the reality of our world, there's deep structural, intimate, and community violence that's present and real. So I'm curious if you might spend a couple minutes just unpacking that. How do we not get into a place where we're falsely reassuring young people of things that we can't promise?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to ask them what makes you feel unsafe, and
Mhm.
explore with them what you can do to improve that sense of safety. I think there's a tendency for us to just try and reassure children whenever they express something that's distressing. So I will share with you a mundane example, because we learn the most about children from our own kids. So that's why I sometimes talk about my children. But I remember coming home one day, and one of my daughters was a teenager at the time. And she looked a little upset. So I said, what's going on? And she said, I'm depressed. And I looked at her and I said, dear, you're not depressed. And she looked at me and she said, how do you know I'm not depressed? And I said, well, I guess I don't really know you're not depressed. Maybe what I meant was, it would upset me if you were depressed. And she goes, well, it upsets me too that I'm depressed, but you seem to indicate you wanted to help. And I don't see how you could do that if it's too uncomfortable for you to talk about. I said, okay, dear, you're absolutely wrong. Right, I made a mistake. And so that's a good learning point for me and for you, that if you ever do feel depressed, I want you to tell me that, even though it would bother me, because it would bother me more if I found out I wasn't able to help you. So then she looked at me and she said, well, I'm not clinically depressed. And it was really hard not to say, that's what I meant. But then I realized that would mean, the way I described it is, I would win the battle but lose the war. My daughter was right. I made a mistake. I should own that mistake and not try and take credit for being right. So I said, well, good. I am glad about that. But if you ever are depressed, I really want you to talk to me about it, or if anything bothers you, because I know I don't want it to happen. I don't want you to be upset, but I really want to help you when you are. So anyway, I think the first situation is to kind of resist that temptation to try and tell children that they really are safe. Now, they are relatively safe. They are not in as much danger if they were in the middle of Israel or Gaza or Ukraine or in any of the areas that are dealing with current armed conflict. But they are not completely safe. And no matter what community they're in or what we do to try and improve those communities, there are still risks. So more what I would be trying to tell children is, you don't have, what is it that you're worried about? And then if they say, I'm worried about X, may be able to say, well, that I don't think you need to worry about. So the example I often use is in the middle of our response to 9/11. Um, my younger daughter saw a plane fly overhead, and she looked at me, she looked upset, and I said, are you worried about something? And she said, well, I hear that planes are now bombing Afghanistan. And I said, yes, what concern do you have? And she said, well, could that plane have a bomb, and could they drop it on us by mistake? So I explained to her that that was a commuter jet for a nearby airport, and that the fighter jets actually load the bombs closer to where they drop them. And so, no, the planes that fly overhead in Connecticut are not going to be able to drop a bomb on us because they don't carry them. And she was like, oh, good to know. So that's an example of, I could at least say, I can't tell her that she's not going to get in a car accident. I can't tell her that someone's not going to hurt her. I can tell her all the things that we're going to do to keep her safe, and why I believe she is safe in school and safe in her community and safe in her home. But I can't tell her that nothing bad can happen. I can only tell her what we can do to keep her as safe as possible.
The starting sentence of asking what safety means to you, actually, it made me think and invite me as an adult to also think, what does safety mean for me? And I want to name that there was someone in the Q&A that just asked about the feelings of hopelessness for us as adults, and how the feelings of hopelessness and powerlessness, if we're having them as adults, how we can hold that in tandem with the young people that we care about and love. And I have wondering if the invitation for us to sit with that it's okay to not have the answer, the not okay is to feel uncomfortable to say, I don't have the answer and we're figuring this out together, or this is painful for me. And so I imagine this is painful for you. The ability to walk with a young person instead of walk at a young person is the work. I'm just, anyway, I'm reflecting, David.
Yeah, so part of it, I guess, when I read that is that one of the ways you deal with feeling hopeless as an adult is to recognize that's how you're feeling. And it's okay in the midst of a war to feel sad and feel that you wish you could prevent this, and it's really bad that you can't. And sometimes you just have to say that to kids. I don't understand why people would do something like this. No, this shouldn't happen. It has happened, though. So I think that for me, part of what can make me more hopeful is recognizing that if I'm hopeless at a particular point in time when something horrible has happened, is that that's an understandable reaction. And that at another time, I hope and expect I will feel less hopeless. And over time, I've been exposed to so many tragedies, but I've also seen the resolution of those tragedies. Not that they go away. There's often destruction, loss, and that persists. But I do see communities that at the time of their most despair, but I also see them sometime afterwards. And I see that hope often does come back. And that I understand there are some communities that have way more tragedy and loss than they ever should have. And I think we need to do something about that. I'm not suggesting that we just tolerate that, but I do know that hopelessness is often followed by more hopeful experiences. And that's what gives me hope. Not because of what happened. They're horrible tragedies. The other thing, Leora, that I did want to say, because that's something I've learned in spending some more time with you, is that when we talk about feelings of safety, those feelings of safety are not all physical safety. It can be emotional safety. It could be safety for somebody who maybe is of a different background or is in a group that's been marginalized or discriminated against. And they don't feel safe even as professionals in professional discussions. And sometimes I feel like saying, oh, you should feel safe. We value you. But I realize if your experience is that you don't feel safe, then I need to kind of acknowledge and sit with that. I can't just reassure them that that's unrealistic because it comes from their experience. So again, it really gets to the whole issue of, I think We just need to try to understand how other people feel based on their experience and context, but we can't always change it, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dr. Schoenfeld. I'm going to end with this poem. This month is National Children's Bereavement Awareness Month. So I want to name that we are knowing and holding, that we're talking about how to talk to children about humanitarian crises. And that is with the gift that children are alive and well to be in conversation about humanitarian crises when we know that there are so many young people grieving and to be grieved. So I'm going to read this out loud and then we will close. I wish children didn't die. I wish they would be temporarily elevated to the skies until war ends. Then they would return home safe. When their parents would ask them, "Where were you?" they would say, "We were playing in the clouds." Gasan Kananafi. May all children that you love be safe and free, be held and know that they are worthy to be in conversation with, worthy to be listened to, worthy to be concerned for.